Hi everyone, welcome to CSCI100, lecture 16. This lecture is largely focused on the ideas of pass by reference and pass by value, which are very closely related to the ideas from the last few lectures about destructive and non-destructive functions. We'll start off with a bit of a review here on scope and also the meaning of a void function. So what is scope? It's come up a few times, mostly in the context of functions. So scope has to do with where a variable is visible. And there's two kinds of scope that we talked about. There's global scope, and these are variables that are in the global frame. And then there's local scope. And this variables with global scope can be used anywhere. With local scope, they can only be used in the block of code where that variable is defined. And just as for global scope variables, they're in the global frame. For local scope variables, they are in the local frame. And we've seen that this local stuff really only comes up when we're talking about functions, and it's the parameters and variables that are defined in that function that have the local scope. Now, I'll jog your memory about frames here too. Whenever the function gets executed, this local frame gets created. And this local frame is kind of like a page in memory, an additional page in memory, where you can write down certain values. And any variable assignments that happen inside the function, which aren't explicitly labeled like global, if the variable isn't labeled global, that variable gets written down in the local frame. So in the local frame. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at an example. We have this code here, def add 2 num. So we do num equals num plus 2. And out here we have num equals 8, and we're going to call add 2 and pass in this num. So what happens when this code gets run? Well, actually, why don't we pull this up in Python Tutor and see for ourselves. So when this program gets run, first in line 5, num8 is created not inside of a function. It's a variable that's created outside of a function. And so the number 8, the variable num, gets assigned a value 8 in the global frame, right here in the global frame. And now when we go to call our, and so in line 6, when we print out the value of num is 8 because we look in the global frame. But now when we call the add2 function and we pass in num, the very first thing that happens is the argument, which here is num, gets referenced. And so the value of this variable is 8. And we assign that value to the parameter, which is also called num. They happen to have the same name, and that's okay. They don't have to, but they do. And so we see the variable num gets created in the local frame with a value of 8, because that is the value that was passed in as a parameter, as an argument. And so inside here, we do num equals num plus 2, because this assignment is happening inside of our function, and we didn't use the global keyword, which allows us to, which tells the function for this particular variable, use the global frame. It's the variable in the local frame that gets updated. So here, num8 becomes num10. And so inside the function, when we print out the value of num is equal to 10 right here. You can see that that gets printed inside the function. Now, crucially, when we come back out, when we return back to the global frame, this local frame is just thrown away. We toss it away because the function is done executing. And so when we print out the value of num after the function, it still has a value of 8 because that is the number, the value that's stored in the global frame for the variable num. Oops. Now, the other topic I will cover here in this video is the idea of a void function. This is something you already know, but I'm going to give it a name here. We know that functions can return something, and optionally they have a function doesn't have to return something. So you could have a function with no return. In fact, a common function that has no return is the print function. So when we so just pull this up here. When we call print, nothing gets returned. Something gets written to the screen. The pixels in the terminal get changed, but nothing is returned. A function that doesn't have a return statement will return this special value called none. And I can show you this. Whoops. Actually, I can just run this code again and show you. When we get to calling the function, once we get to the very last line in the function here, line 3, and nothing has been returned, there's no return statement, you can see that the return value from our function gets set to be none. We call functions that return none a void function. That's just this the way we call this. Maybe void because like a void is somewhere where there's nothing. And so these two functions do the same thing. Whether you explicitly return none or you just leave out the return, both of these functions return none. That's all a void function is a function that returns none.